Hello there, and welcome to Forgotten Worlds. My name is Thomas, and tonight, I'd like to invite you to drift with me into one of the oldest and most mysterious questions we have ever asked. What really happens when we die? Science tells us that death is the end of biological function, the heart no longer beating, the brain no longer firing. And yet, behind the clinical clarity of that definition lingers a silence that feels unfinished. Because consciousness, your awareness, your thoughts, your sense of self does not simply dissolve as neatly as a stopped clock. It leaves a riddle. What if that riddle points not to an ending, but a return? Not to nothingness, but to something older, a civilization beyond this one, waiting just past the threshold of death. As you settle in tonight, perhaps lying in the quiet of your own room, I invite you to imagine this possibility, not as an answer, but as an exploration. We won't be rushing to conclusions. Instead, we'll take our time, moving gently through what cultures, myths, and even modern experiences suggest. Across centuries and continents, people have spoken of tunnels of light, of familiar voices calling, of landscapes that feel like home. Myths describe vast societies of the dead cities, fields, halls where ancestors gather. Could it be that death is less an ending and more a migration? That with each final breath we are not vanishing, but crossing into the oldest civilization of all? Tonight, we begin with the mystery itself, death as science defines it, and the unanswered question that follows: what becomes of the self when the body falls silent? To understand this journey, we must begin with what we know. Modern medicine defines death as the irreversible cessation of biological function. When the heart stops beating, blood no longer circulates. Without circulation, oxygen cannot reach the organs. The brain, that intricate lattice of electrical signals and chemical exchanges, falls into silence. Within minutes, neurons begin to die, and with them, the intricate patterns of thought, memory, and personality that made up a human life. It sounds absolute, almost mechanical, a body reduced to processes of failure. And yet, even in this clinical description, there is a haunting gap, because science can measure when the heart no longer pumps, when the brain no longer sparks. But science does not yet explain what happens to the experience within the self that lived inside those signals. Imagine sitting in a quiet room, closing your eyes, and noticing the thoughts that drift across your mind. They are intangible, ungraspable. You cannot weigh them, cannot point to them directly, and yet they feel more real than anything. Consciousness, that undeniable fact of being aware, is at once the most familiar and the most elusive phenomenon we know. At death, the machinery stops. But the question that lingers is, does the awareness stop as well? Or does it slip away, like vapor escaping from a broken vessel, moving into some space we cannot yet measure? Neuroscience has made extraordinary progress in mapping the brain. We know regions light up when we see, when we dream, when we remember a loved one's face. But knowing which areas activate does not explain why there is something it feels like to experience those things. This is sometimes called the hard problem of consciousness. Why do sparks of electricity give rise to an inner world at all? And so, when death comes, we are left with a paradox. We can chart the collapse of organs, the fading of oxygen, the stillness of blood. We can even predict the exact timeline in which cells die, tissues decay, and the body returns to the earth. But we cannot say, with certainty, whether the conscious self ends in that moment or whether it travels onward. Perhaps you've been at the bedside of someone passing. The room goes still, their breath slows, their features soften, and then there is an absence, sudden and unmistakable. The body remains, but the person feels gone. Where did they go? Did they vanish into nothingness? Or is there some continuation, invisible to us but as real to them as this world feels to us now? Medical science often frames this as an unsolvable question, something beyond its scope. But for thousands of years, human beings have filled that silence with stories, visions, and myths. And strangely, those stories often share a remarkable consistency across cultures. They speak of thresholds, of journeys, of places beyond. It is as if humanity itself has always sensed that death is not simply a wall, but perhaps a door. This uncertainty has profound weight. It shapes how we live, how we grieve, how we imagine the purpose of our lives. For if death is the final extinguishing of consciousness, then everything we are must fit into the span of a single lifetime. But if death is a passage, then perhaps life is a chapter, not the whole book. Before we drift into those possibilities, it is worth pausing here, in this quiet tension between science and mystery. Death, by biological definition, is clear and final. But what consciousness truly is, and where it goes when the body fails, remains one of the deepest enigmas of existence. And yet, even as science holds its silence on the fate of consciousness, there are countless voices, quiet testimonies whispered across centuries that suggest something continues. These are the near-death experiences, the visions of tunnels of light, the sudden sensation of rising above one's own body, looking down at the still figure that once felt like home. Consider the thousands of accounts gathered from people who were clinically dead for moments or who stood on the threshold of death before being pulled back. They often describe the same strange geography, a tunnel or corridor filled with radiance, a sense of being drawn toward it, and the presence of figures waiting, sometimes loved ones, sometimes beings they can barely name, but all suffused with familiarity and peace. These stories emerge across cultures and across time. A child in modern America speaks of floating above a hospital bed. A farmer in rural India describes being led down a path by ancestors. An elder in a remote village recalls voices calling from a great river of light. Different languages, different religions, different lives, and yet the pattern repeats. Skeptics will point to physiology. The dying brain, deprived of oxygen, may produce hallucinations. Electrical storms in the temporal lobe can create vivid visions, even a sense of leaving the body. Chemistry can flood the mind with feelings of peace or terror. These explanations are not without weight, and yet, they do not fully erase the uncanny consistency of the accounts. Why should a starved brain conjure tunnels, light, and reunion so reliably across so many different lives? Why should these experiences bring not just images, but profound transformation, leaving those who return with an altered sense of life, of purpose, of peace? Perhaps what we call hallucination is more like a window. Perhaps in those fragile moments, consciousness is not simply breaking apart, but breaking through. Imagine for a moment stepping beyond your own body. Looking down, you see yourself lying there, fragile and unmoving, and then your gaze is pulled upward into a vast corridor of light. There is no fear. The air itself seems to welcome you, like the warmth of sunlight after a long night. At the far end of the passage, shapes are waiting. They are not strangers. You know them, though you cannot explain how. Their presence feels like home. This vision, reported by thousands, invites a question. Are we catching glimpses of another civilization, one older than memory, one that exists not in history books but in whatever lies beyond death? Think of how often cultures describe the journey of the soul as a passage, a crossing of rivers, a walking down paths, a flight toward a shining place. Egypt spoke of the Duat, a realm where the soul traveled through gates and landscapes after the body's end. The Greeks imagined the soul crossing the river Styx with Charon, ferryman of the dead. In Norse myth, spirits traversed the shadowed realm of hell before finding halls where warriors feasted. And in modern testimonies, the themes echo tunnels instead of rivers, light instead of feasting halls. But the essence remains. The soul continues. It moves. It arrives somewhere. Across the world, in traditions that span thousands of years, death has rarely been seen as a final curtain. Instead, it is a door that opens into another cycle, another chance, another chapter in an endless unfolding. In Hindu philosophy, this cycle is called samsara, the wheel of birth, death, and rebirth. A soul, or Atman, moves from one body to the next, shaped by the weight of karma, the accumulation of choices and actions across lifetimes. Death, then, is not an ending, but a moment of transfer. Imagine the soul as a traveler stepping off one train only to board another, carrying with it the luggage of memory, habit, and unresolved lessons. The destination may change: a different family, a different land, even a different form of life, but the journey continues, as it always has. Buddhism carries a similar vision, though with a subtle shift. Rebirth is not about a permanent soul, but about the continuation of consciousness itself, flowing like a river. Each life is a wave rising and falling on the surface of a greater current. What you call you is not a fixed thing, but a pattern that emerges, dissolves, and emerges again. In this view, death is less a wall than a ripple, carrying forward tendencies, desires, and unfinished threads into another existence. The ultimate goal, of course, is not endless cycling, but liberation, nirvana, the extinguishing of the wheel, a return to the vastness beyond. Among indigenous traditions, too, we find echoes of return. Many First Nations peoples in North America speak of life as a circle, not a line. Birth, growth, death, and renewal are all part of the same great turning. The Lakota, for instance, hold that death is a return to the spirit world, a place not of distance but of nearness, where the ancestors remain present, guiding, watching, reminding the living of their place in the circle. In the Australian Aboriginal dreaming, life and death are woven into the eternal presence of the dream time, a reality that does not vanish with death but is entered more deeply. These traditions share a simple but profound reframing. Death is not conclusion, it is continuity. It is not a breaking, but a folding back into something older, something ongoing. And here, the speculation becomes irresistible. What if each death is not just another turn of a cycle, but a re-entry into an ancient realm that existed long before our births? A civilization not built of stone and wood, but of memory, of consciousness itself. Perhaps when you die, you are not stepping into something new at all. Perhaps you are returning to the place you began. Picture it, the moment of passing, when the last breath leaves the body. Instead of fading, you awaken to find yourself standing in a city of light, vast and familiar, as though you have lived there countless times before. The streets stretch not in miles but in memories. The walls are inscribed not with letters but with the echoes of lives once lived. And waiting there are those you thought you had lost, greeting you not as a stranger but as a citizen returning home after a long absence. Could it be that reincarnation is not simply the recycling of energy into new lives, but the rhythm of coming and going between worlds here and there, body and spirit, life and the civilization beyond? Each death a departure, each birth a return, each cycle a reminder that the border between worlds is not fixed but porous. Among those who have stood near the edge of death, a striking phrase emerges again and again: "I felt like I was going home." It is not said with fear, but with a kind of quiet certainty. People who have been revived after cardiac arrest, or who have hovered in the liminal state between life and death, often describe a sensation not of ending, but of arrival. They speak of peace that feels older than memory, of landscapes that seem familiar though they have never walked them, of voices that do not introduce themselves because introductions are unnecessary. This theme of death as a return, not a departure, stretches across cultures. In Tibetan accounts of the bardo, the soul moves through luminous realms that feel at once alien and deeply intimate, as though rediscovering its true dwelling. In the Christian tradition, the dying often describe going to the Father's house, a home prepared beyond earthly walls. In indigenous stories, the ancestors do not greet the departed as guests, but as family returning to the circle. there is something profoundly human about the image of home. Home is not just a structure of walls and doors, it is the place where we are known, where we belong without effort. To describe death in this way is to suggest that what waits beyond is not strangeness, but recognition. Speculatively, this raises a haunting possibility. What if the civilization of the dead is not only real, but is in fact our true origin? Life on Earth could be a kind of exile, a temporary journey outward. Birth may be a departure from the city of souls, and death the act of returning. Imagine a society that is not bound by time as we know it, where seconds do not slip away but all moments exist at once. To step back into such a place would not feel like discovery, but like remembrance. The testimonies of the dying echo this. They speak of overwhelming familiarity, as though they had been there before. Some say they felt more themselves in those fleeting moments than they ever did in waking life. As if the body was always a kind of garment, and death is the act of stepping back into one's true skin. Picture yourself at the threshold, the final breath leaving your body, the room around you fading. Instead of fear, a warmth spreads through you. The weight of years lifts. You do not feel lost, you feel found. Ahead, not darkness, but a light that bends and gathers into shapes, faces, voices. They do not ask who you are, they already know. They have always known. If death feels like going home, then perhaps the reason is simple. Maybe, in some deep and hidden way, we already remember it. Carl Jung once spoke of archetypes, those recurring patterns of story and symbol that surface again and again in myths, dreams, and religions. He believed these were not inventions of individual minds, but shared inheritances of the collective unconscious images and motifs carried by humanity as a whole. The mother, the hero, the wise old man, the shadow, they appear in Greek myth, in Hindu legend, in indigenous tales, in modern cinema. They seem to rise not from culture alone, but from something older than culture, something embedded in the human psyche. What if the afterlife myths of the world, the rivers, the tunnels, the bridges, the cities of the dead, are not mere inventions either? What if they, too, are archetypes, not simply metaphors for fear and longing, but echoes of a place we once knew? Consider how consistently cultures describe the dead always traveling to a new realm. The ancient Egyptians spoke of fields of reeds where the departed lived among ancestors. The Greeks envisioned shadowy plains across the Styx. The Norse told of halls in Valhalla and Hell. In Mesoamerican traditions, souls descended into layered underworlds, sometimes for years, before reaching rest. And in cultures oceans apart, without contact or exchange, indigenous people also spoke of paths the dead must walk, bridges they must cross, and communities waiting on the other side. Why does humanity return to these motifs again and again? Is it coincidence, a projection of our shared fear of endings, or is it memory? Speculatively, it could be that the civilization of death imprints itself on us before we are born. That when we take on the form of flesh, something in us still carries the faint residue of where we came from. And though the memory fades in childhood, though it is buried beneath language, schooling, and daily life, it stirs again in myth, in dream, in those strange moments when the veil feels thin. Imagine for a moment that myths are not fiction, but fragments. Fragments of a map once clear, now scattered across cultures like pieces of a shattered mirror. One story speaks of a river, another of a tunnel, another of a shining city. Each culture holds part of the picture, and together they whisper of a realm beyond death that humanity, in its deepest memory, has never forgotten. And perhaps this is why the accounts of near-death experiences and visions of the dying feel so familiar. They do not introduce new landscapes, but revisit ones we already know. We recognize them not because we learned them here, but because we lived them before. If we are welcomed back into a place already known, then death itself becomes less an end and more a crossing. And across cultures, the image of the crossing is everywhere. The ancient Greeks imagined Charon, the ferryman of the Styx, guiding souls across dark waters in his small boat. The dead could not make the journey alone. They needed a coin placed in their mouth or on their eyes as payment. Without it, they would wander the shore forever. In this myth, death was not disappearance, but a passage requiring preparation, ritual, and guidance. In the Norse world, the soul's journey was cast in the image of the Bifrost, the great rainbow bridge connecting Midgard, the realm of the living, to Asgard, the home of gods and honored dead. To step upon that shimmering arc was to move from one society into another, leaving behind the noise of battle and the chill of winter for the endless feasts of Valhalla or the quiet halls of hell. In indigenous Australian traditions, the rainbow serpent takes on a similar role, not as bridge but as pathway, a cosmic being whose body creates the channels by which spirits move from the earthly realm to the dreaming. The serpent is not merely a symbol of death, but of creation and renewal, reminding us that the journey of the soul is woven into the same cycles that shape rivers, rain, and earth itself. Even in modern accounts of near-death experiences, the imagery returns. People describe tunnels of light, corridors that stretch beyond sight, thresholds that must be crossed before reaching a new place. The symbols change, but the pattern remains. There is always a path. There is always a passage. There is always a traveler moving from one society into another. And perhaps this is the most enduring truth of our myths, that death is not a sudden vanishing, but a journey, one that requires bridges, guides, or rivers because it leads somewhere. No culture envisions the soul trapped in stillness. It is always in motion, always heading toward community, toward reunion, toward a civilization waiting just beyond the horizon. Speculatively, this suggests that the societies of the dead are not hidden in some unreachable heaven or underworld, but are instead woven just beyond the threshold of perception. To die is to take a step sideways, to cross a bridge so thin we do not see it in life. And yet, when the time comes, we all will walk it. Imagine yourself as that traveler, stepping off the bank of the Styx, feeling the wooden boat rock beneath your feet as Charon pushes off with his oar. Or perhaps you are standing on the Bifrost, light shimmering beneath your steps, leading you toward halls echoing with laughter and song. Or perhaps you move along the curves of the rainbow serpent, guided by its eternal body into the dreaming, where ancestors wait in a world beyond time. If death is travel, then it must also have destinations. And the myths of the world describe those destinations with remarkable detail, not vague realms of mist, but places with streets, gates, fields, and halls. Places that sound less like abstractions and more like societies. The Egyptians spoke of the Duat, the vast underworld through which the soul traveled after death. It was not a single realm but a complex geography, complete with rivers of fire, caverns, islands, and palaces. The soul, guided by spells from the Book of the Dead, moved through gates guarded by serpents, past judgment halls where Osiris presided, until at last it might reach the Field of Reeds, a mirror of Egypt itself. There, the departed ploughed fields, sailed boats, and lived in communities not unlike those they had known in life. In Norse tradition, Valhalla was not an empty heaven but a hall of warriors, its rafters made from spears, its walls from shields, its benches filled with the honored dead. Meals were served from the ever-renewing boar, Saerimner, drink poured from endless horns, and each night the fallen feasted together. Other souls went to hell, a place not of torment but of quiet dwelling, where families were reunited and the dead lived on in a parallel order. The Greeks gave us Elysium, the isles of the blessed shining fields where poets, heroes, and the righteous lived in harmony. Homer described it as a place of soft breezes, fertile soil, and unending joy, a civilization set apart from mortal decay. And in Mesoamerican traditions, the Aztec afterlife was mapped in elaborate stages. Souls traveled through Miklan, a realm of 9 layers, each with its own trials. Winds that stripped flesh, rivers that required crossing, mountains that shifted beneath one's feet. Only after completing the journey could the soul rest. Far from being abstract, this was a world with structure, geography, and community. When we look across these traditions, a pattern emerges. Death leads not to a void, but to a mapped society. Storytellers across time spoke of streets, rivers, gates, bridges, halls, and homes. These were not random inventions, but blueprints, repeated with astonishing consistency across cultures that never touched one another. Speculatively, one might wonder, were these ancient maps mere imagination, or were they glimpses of real places beyond death? Could it be that storytellers were not inventing, but remembering that shamans, visionaries, and the dying themselves carried back descriptions of another world, and those visions became the seeds of myth? Imagine the possibility that beyond the veil there are indeed cities, fields, and halls not made of stone or wood, but of something finer, luminous yet substantial. A civilization that mirrors ours not by accident, but because ours was modeled after it. The pyramids, the temples, the halls of kings, perhaps they were not only monuments to the dead, but echoes of a society that already existed on the other side. To see death as entry into a civilization is also to see it as migration, the most profound kind of movement from one land to another. Just as travelers leave behind familiar soil and set foot in a new country, so too the dying leave behind the known rhythms of heartbeat and breath to cross into a different realm. This comparison is not just poetic, it is deeply embedded in human culture. In ancient Egypt, the dead were prepared for their journey with careful rites. Bodies were wrapped, organs preserved, texts inscribed, not only to honor the departed, but to equip them as travelers. The Book of the Dead was, in essence, a passport, a guidebook through customs and gates, filled with passwords and spells that would allow the soul to navigate checkpoints in the afterlife. The Greeks placed coins with their dead obols for Charon, payment for the ferry across the Styx. Without them, the soul might be stranded on the wrong shore. In other cultures, food, water, tools, and clothing were buried alongside the deceased, as though preparing them for a long voyage. In some indigenous traditions, songs were sung over the body, maps of the spirit world encoded in melody, so the soul would not lose its way. Everywhere, death was imagined as a border crossing, a threshold guarded by rules, rituals, and guides. The living did not send their dead empty-handed. They prepared them as emigrants, moving not into nothing, but into a society that expected them. And just as with earthly migration, the act is bittersweet. To leave one country is to arrive in another. For those left behind, there is grief, the absence of a friend, a parent, a child. But for the traveler, there is continuity. There is entry. There is reunion with others who crossed before. Speculatively, this makes death less an abyss and more a kind of cosmic immigration system. Earth is one nation, bounded by the borders of flesh and time. The afterlife is another, older one, populated by ancestors, mythic figures, and perhaps entire civilizations of the soul. When we die, we do not fall into void. We step across the border, carrying with us the passport of memory, the luggage of experience, and the inheritance of all who came before. Picture it, the moment of death as arriving at a vast gate. Beyond it stretches a city of light or a field of endless green, its air shimmering with recognition. At the threshold, figures wait, not officials demanding paperwork, but loved ones and guides, welcoming you as if you had simply returned from a long journey abroad. Your passage is not exile, it is homecoming. If the dead cross borders into another society, then what kind of society is it? Many cultures imagined it not only as a realm of souls, but as a civilization of gods, divine communities that exist in parallel to our own. Eternal reflections of the human world, perfected and enduring. On the peaks of Olympus, the Greeks placed their pantheon. Zeus, Hera, Athena, Apollo, they lived not in abstraction, but in halls of marble and gold, feasting, quarreling, ruling, and creating. Olympus was not just a mountain, it was a city of the divine, layered above mortal Greece the way clouds layer above the land. To die, in Greek imagination, was not merely to vanish, but perhaps to ascend into proximity with these gods, to dwell near their radiant society. In the north, the Norse envisioned Asgard, home of Odin and the Aesir. It was a walled stronghold connected to earth by the Bifrost Bridge, its halls echoing with mead, song, and prophecy. For warriors chosen in death, Asgard was a continuation of life's battles and feasts, but on an eternal stage where time bent differently and where honor never faded. To die in valor was to be recruited into the divine civilization, a citizen of Odin's company. And in the Aztec world, the afterlife was no mere shadow. The underworld of Mictlan was ruled by deities Mictlantecuhtli and Mictlantecutli, who presided over the dead as sovereigns of a vast kingdom. Souls passed through its 9 layers, each stage a kind of initiation, until they were fully absorbed into its order. Death, in this vision, was not absence but citizenship, entry into a divine domain structured as carefully as any empire. What unites these myths is their portrayal of gods not as distant abstractions, but as rulers, architects, and hosts of civilizations. They had palaces, courts, councils, and laws. And the dead, by joining them, were not lost, they were absorbed into societies greater than their own. Speculatively, perhaps these divine civilizations are not only stories. What if Olympus, Asgard, and Mictlan are cultural windows into the same eternal city, glimpsed through different lenses? Each culture may have translated the ineffable into its own symbols, mountains, bridges, or underworld gates, but all may be pointing to the same truth: that the dead do not disperse into silence, but rejoin a civilization far older, one inhabited not only by the souls of humanity, but by beings we once called gods. If myths speak of divine societies, then the testimonies of modern near-death experiences seem to echo them in unexpected ways. Over and over, those who have crossed the threshold and returned describe visions not just of tunnels or light, but of places structured, coherent, almost architectural realms that feel less like dreams and more like glimpses of another civilization. Many report what they call cities of light, vast spaces filled with radiant buildings, streets that seem to glow from within, communities of beings who move with calm purpose. Some describe towers or halls that shimmer like crystal, others fields that are not empty wilderness but cultivated as though part of an ordered society. Strikingly, these descriptions come from people of different cultures, languages, and beliefs, yet the imagery overlaps in uncanny ways. In medical journals, such visions are often recorded with cautious neutrality, noted as subjective experiences during cardiac arrest or coma. But the language of those who lived them is anything but neutral. They speak of familiarity, of recognition, of knowing they had been there before. They insist it was not hallucination, but revelation. Could it be that these are not private fantasies but shared glimpses of the same realm? If multiple people, with no contact and no shared myth, describe similar cities, then perhaps they are perceiving something real, fragments of a civilization beyond death, seen only in moments when consciousness slips free of the body. Imagine waking into such a place, a city without shadows, its avenues lined not with stone but with light itself. Figures move gently around you, not strangers but companions. Their presence feels ancient yet welcoming. There is no sense of chaos, no confusion, only order, harmony, and community. To stand there, even for a moment, is to feel less like a visitor and more like a returning resident. Speculatively, this suggests that the civilization of the dead is not hidden in myth alone, but is still visible to us, in flashes, through those who have brushed its threshold. Each account may be a fragment of a larger map, glimpses of the same world described in many languages. And if so, then perhaps the afterlife is not as distant as we imagine, but woven just beyond the fabric of ordinary perception, a luminous city waiting for us all, glimpsed briefly in the liminal hours when life and death meet. If stories of gods and ancestors hint at an older order beyond the horizon of life, then the soft, insistent testimony of modern near-death experiences feels like a lantern held up at the same threshold, a glow that reveals shapes, angles, and, most curiously, structures. Again and again, people who were pronounced clinically dead for minutes, or who hovered in the thin air between departure and return, speak not only of a tunnel and a light, but of places that seem planned, coherent, and communal. Not dreams dissolving at the edges, but districts, avenues, gardens, and halls that carry the unmistakable calm of a city at dawn. You can think of these accounts as travelers' notes hastily scribbled upon waking, incomplete, haunted by awe, sometimes fragmentary, yet strangely consistent across languages and lifetimes. Someone from a busy ward in Manila describes seeing terraces that appeared to be made of light, their steps humming with music that wasn't heard so much as felt. A fisherman far from shore speaks of passing through a narrow passage and emerging into what he could only call a harbor of radiance, where figures moved in quiet conversation along quays that glowed from within. A grandmother in Reykjavik remembers streets without shadows and doors that opened as if welcoming an old friend. A taxi driver in Lagos says he was escorted along a boulevard lined with trees that shone as though the leaves themselves remembered sunlight from another universe. None of these people met, none shared a culture or creed, and yet their language converges on the architectural cities of light, halls, gardens with paths, places that feel organized, purposeful, alive. Medical files will often mark such testimony with careful neutrality. Visual phenomena during cardiac arrest, possible anoxia-induced imagery, an episode consistent with altered states. And of course, physiology must speak. Blood oxygen drops, neural networks misfire, chemical cascades flood perception with unusual color and sound. But notice how that language explains the storm and not the coastline it briefly illuminates. What remains, even after the clinical translation, is the map-like quality of what people report the sense of aware. Again and again, certain features repeat with minor variations, like motifs in a piece of music. There is passage, a corridor, a tunnel, a narrow bridge between the worlds. There is arrival not into fog, but into clarity. There is society figures who gather, greet, or guide, often communicating not with words but with thought, the way memory speaks to you in dreams. There is environment, plazas, gardens, courtyards, colonnades that lean more toward the symbolic than the literal, yet retain the unmistakable grammar of place. There is governance of a gentle kind, not rules, exactly, but a feeling of order, of rightness, as if you have stepped into a city whose laws are the natural shape of belonging. Sometimes in these accounts there are buildings that do what no earthly building can, walls that are translucent and yet sheltering, towers that hum like tuning forks when you approach. Libraries without books, where knowledge appears as luminous patterns that fold into you the way a melody does when you finally understand it. Schools with no teachers and no exams, only an exchange. You stand in a room, and the room becomes an understanding you have always carried. To some, this sounds like metaphor, and perhaps it island. But even metaphors require materials, and these are not the materials of chaos, they are the materials of a civilization. Listen to the personal tone that so many of these travelers adopt when they try to describe what it felt like. It was familiar. I knew the layout before I could see it. I recognized the way the light fell, like coming back to a neighborhood from childhood. They reach for the language of homecoming because the feeling refuses any other. And if you close your eyes for a moment, you can almost imagine the way it would be. Stepping onto a street paved with radiance, the surface cool beneath your feet, the air carrying something like the scent of rain after a long heat. 1,000 quiet conversations moving past you like a tide, each one both intimate and universal. Skeptical minds will offer counter-melodies, and they deserve to be heard. Visual tunnels can arise from the retina starving for oxygen, narrowing perception to a bright center, while the edges dim, a neurological vignette mistaken for a cosmic passage. Temporal lobe activity can produce the sense of presence, the feeling of being out of the body. Chemicals, endogenous or otherwise, can unfurl curtains of color and sound that are deeply persuasive in the moment. Each of these explanations sketches a plausible mechanism. Yet mechanisms are not destinations. They describe the ship, not the shore. They tell us how a radio might be tuned, not whether there is a broadcast moving invisibly through the room. It's here that the cross-cultural pattern presses its gentle hand to our shoulder. Consider how many of these modern accounts, separated by oceans and belief systems, emphasize not isolation but community. The beings met are not merely luminous, they are busy in the best possible sense, engaged in tasks that seem purposeful, comforting, important. Some people report being brought to something like a council or a square, others to a garden where conversations unfold like long-delayed reunions. A few speak, haltingly, of what they call a university, temple, or archive, where the activity is learning, but learning of a sort that is less acquisition and more remembrance, like being read back to yourself from a book you didn't know you wrote. Then there is the life review, often described with startling detail, not a judgment issued from a tribunal, but an immersive unfolding in which you feel the consequences of your actions ripple through other lives. In this telling, one can sense the ethics of a civilization, not laws carved in stone, but empathy made into an atmosphere. You inhale it, and in doing so you understand where harm was done and where kindness took root. Many who return say the review was not condemnation but education, the way a wise old city might teach its citizens without shaming them, restoring them to a common good. Patterns of sound appear too, not always as music in the earthly sense, but as a textured harmony that seems to organize space itself. Imagine walking through a street whose geometry is set by a quiet chord you can feel against your bones. Imagine turning a corner and the chord changes, and with it the quality of light and the memories that rise to meet you. You may have felt something like this in certain places. Here, the hush in a library before a storm, the resonance of a cathedral nave, the way a familiar park holds your childhood in its leaves. Now, imagine that multiplied, clarified, perfected. If we set the medical charts aside and listen to the travelers with the patience night grants us, another possibility begins to take on shape. Perhaps these are not private fantasies at all, but shared vistas of a single realm viewed from different angles, the same city seen at dusk by one, at noon by another, from the river by a third, from the high terraces by a fourth. The tunnel could be an alley, a ferry, a gate, depending on which entrance you happen to reach. The beings who welcome you might wear the faces your heart expects, because translation is an act of mercy, and the first language a home speaks to you in is always your own. Even the small details show up with the persistence of roads that refuse to wash away. Paths bordered by things that feel like trees yet are more than trees, their leaves whispering names you once knew. Bridges without railings because nothing in you fears a fall. Water that is not wet yet carries the memory of every river you loved to watch from a childhood bank. Light that is not bright in a harsh way but rather intelligent, it attends to you, answers the question you didn't know you were asking, and leads you forward without a word. And then there is the boundary, the sense of a point beyond which return would be impossible. People describe it as a low wall, a line of stones, a ribbon of water, a set of steps, a threshold with a gate just ajar. Here the city seems to gather like a tide, waiting. Past this line, they say, there was a certainty of joining, of taking one's place. At the boundary, the familiar voice, mother, father, friend, a being of light, saying with kindness that trembles through you, not yet. It isn't time. Go back. Carry this. Try again. These are the moments that remake a life when it resumes. These are the words that ring in the ears of the returned, not as command, but as gift. If you've ever traveled to a city you somehow loved before arriving, stepping off a train and knowing the turn you need to take, the cafe you'll prefer, the square where you'll sit at dusk, you have a small model of what these testimonies describe. The difference is that here, the feeling isn't informed by guidebooks or photographs. It rises from a deeper place, as if the directions were written into the self you keep behind your day-to-day name. The experiencers often say they were less surprised by the city of light than by how unsurprising it was. The way coming home surprises you not because the furniture is new, but because you suddenly remember where everything goes. Of course, no single account can stand as proof. Even 1,000 might not convince the mind that needs instruments and numbers, and there is wisdom in that caution. This is not a courtroom. This is a night walk through testimonies, letting their shapes collect. The value here is not to compile verdicts, but to recognize that when people slip loose from their bodies and then return, they tend not to report void, or delirium, or a universe without texture. They report neighborhoods, and so a gentle speculation suggests itself. What if these neighborhoods belong to the same civilization mapped by our ancestors in story? What if the field of reeds, Elysium, Valhalla, the dreaming, and the luminous districts of modern NDEs are all cultural windows looking onto an enduring city whose avenues run just behind the skin of this world? A city that is not elsewhere in the sense of distance, but otherwise in the sense of dimension, a turn of perspective, a widening of attention, the way a hidden image reveals itself when you soften your eyes. There is comfort in imagining that such a place exists, yes, but there is also responsibility. If people come back changed, kinder, less fearful, less enamored of small cruelties, it might be because a city like that instructs by example. Order without oppression, belonging without erasure, learning without humiliation, community without noise. Those who return often say they no longer fear dying. More strikingly, many say they fear living less. Because if a hall of light is waiting, then it matters how we prepare to enter it. Not with perfect answers or spotless records, but with the humility of travelers who know that customs on the other side will ask only for the truth of how we loved. You can feel the echo of such a place even now if you let your breath slow and listen to the room you're in. The hum of a distant street, the soft glow from a window, the way objects hold the quiet you've brought home with you, all of it conspires to remind you that you live in many addresses at once. The city of the living is busy with time. The city of light is busy with meaning. Between them there may be only a thin crossing, a small bridge, the width of a single heartbeat. So picture, if you like, the map you carry tucked inside your chest. It's not printed on paper, it's drawn in the language of feeling. On that map, a narrow passage leads to a gate, and beyond the gate the avenues braid outward toward gardens, schools, libraries, meeting halls, homes. Not everyone will enter by the same street. Some will arrive near the water, others under an arch of trees, still others into a plaza where familiar hands are already reaching. But the city is one. It receives without hurry. It returns what you are to what you have always been. And if many people, separated by distance and doctrine, are sketching similar maps in the margins of their second chance at life, then perhaps the overlap is not accident. Perhaps they are all catching the same broadcast on radios jostled by a storm. Perhaps they are all standing on different overlooks along the rim of a single valley, pointing to the clustered lights that shimmer there at twilight. Perhaps, and let the word do its soft work, perhaps the civilization of the dead is not hidden at all. Perhaps it is simply adjacent, nearer than your next thought, luminous without glare, patient as the shore. and every now and then visible when the tide of life pulls back just far enough for the wet sand to gleam with another world. This does not conclude anything, it only widens the room, and in that wider room, these modern glimpses take their place beside ancient maps, together describing not an abstraction but a destination. A society with streets and songs, with learning and welcome, with memory for walls and belonging for air. If you ever step there, they suggest, you will not be a tourist, you will not be lost. You will look up, see the avenues opening like a book you loved in childhood, and you will remember the way home. When people describe their near-death experiences, there is often another detail, quieter than the visions of light or the presence of loved ones, but no less astonishing. They speak of time, or rather, the absence of it. Some say the moments stretched into eternities. Others say eternity collapsed into a single moment, a whole lifetime passed before their eyes in seconds. Or a second expanded until it felt larger than a century. In those glimpses, time did not march forward as it does here. It flowed differently. Or perhaps it did not flow at all. Modern science reminds us that time is not as rigid as our daily clocks suggest. In Einstein's relativity, time bends with gravity, slows with motion, stretches across space. An astronaut orbiting Earth ages a fraction more slowly than a twin left on the ground. Time, then, is not universal, it is relative. If it is relative here, tethered to matter and energy, what happens when the tether of the body is cut? Perhaps that is why so many who return from death describe a place where time is no longer a river, but an ocean. You do not move through it. You are immersed in it. Past, present, and future coexist, layered like light in a prism. Imagine standing in a city of souls where every step takes you not forward, but deeper, through concentric rings of time that all exist at once. You could speak with ancestors 1,000 years gone and greet descendants not yet born, all in the same breath. This may be why cultures describe the afterlife as eternal. The Egyptians called it the field of reeds, a place without decay. The Greeks spoke of the Isles of the Blessed, where heroes lived in perpetual spring. In Buddhist cosmology, higher realms are measured in eons so vast they dwarf the age of the stars. Again and again, death is linked with the timeless. Not because it is empty, but because it operates beyond the pulse of days and years. And if time flows differently there, then civilizations beyond death would not age as ours do. Empires rise and fall here on Earth because time erodes them. Stone crumbles, memory fades, generations change. But in a timeless realm, a hall built once would never collapse. A song sung once would never end. A civilization there could endure not for centuries or millennia, but forever, not because it resists change, but because it exists outside change altogether. Speculatively, this suggests that every death is not an end but a re-entry into that timeless order. When you die, your thread is not cut. It is gathered back into a tapestry that already contains every moment that was and every moment that will be. To us, standing here, it looks like departure, but from the other side, it is simply reunion, a return to eternity. Think of it this way. Imagine holding a book. You, alive, read page by page, word by word, moving through the story in sequence. But to someone holding the whole book at once, every page already exists, past, present, and future together. Perhaps life is reading the story, and death is stepping back to hold the book. If that is true, then the civilization of the dead is not just older than ours, it is outside the very measure of age. Its streets do not erode, its walls do not collapse, because time cannot touch them. It is not ancient because it has lasted long. It is ancient because it has always been. And so, every death is not merely a crossing of a border, but a reconnection with that vast, timeless order. A reminder that our lives are temporary not because we vanish, but because we have stepped into the moving stream for a little while. When the stream ends, we return to the stillness beyond it, not silence, but eternity, where civilizations hum like constellations, unchanging and enduring, waiting for us to remember our place among them. When we look at the story of humanity, one of the most striking patterns is how often civilizations rise, flourish, and eventually fall. Empires stretch across continents, only to fragment into dust. Kingdoms reach dazzling heights of art and philosophy, then slip into decline. Great cities, once alive with light and sound, become ruins, their walls silent under the slow patience of moss and sand. Think of Mesopotamia, where some of the earliest cities were raised along the fertile banks of the Tigris and Euphrates. From there came writing, law codes, trade routes, astronomy, the very foundations of organized society. Yet the cities of Ur and Babylon, once symbols of permanence, are now archaeological sites, their grandeur collapsed into clay. Egypt, too, endured for millennia, its pharaohs commanding through pyramids and temples that sought to defy time itself. And yet dynasties ended, monuments weathered, and the Nile carried their stories further downstream. Rome, the empire that called itself eternal, held sway over vast territories, only to crumble under the weight of invasions, divisions, and its own ambition. The pattern is clear: birth, expansion, decline, renewal. Civilizations are not fixed, but cyclical, much like the lives of individuals. And just as the wheel of samsara turns in the spiritual traditions of India, perhaps history itself reflects a larger rhythm, one that extends beyond Earth. Many myths echo this idea. Hindu cosmology speaks of vast ages called yugas, where civilizations rise and fall in cycles measured not in centuries, but in millions of years. The universe itself, according to this vision, breathes in cycles of creation and destruction, each age dissolving only to begin again. The Aztecs spoke of suns, great epochs of the world, each destroyed by fire, flood, or darkness, and each replaced by another. In Norse mythology, there is Ragnarok, the great twilight where the world as it is collapses, only to be reborn anew, green and fertile, with gods and humans beginning again. What if these myths are not merely stories of cosmic drama, but faint recollections of a truth? That civilizations, whether human or divine, do not vanish into nothingness, but shift planes, move cycles, return in different forms. Speculatively, it may be that death itself is part of this same rhythm. Each soul, like each empire, rises in one form, grows, gathers memory, and then dissolves, only to be reborn elsewhere. And if the individual mirrors the collective, perhaps our human civilizations are echoes of a grander pattern. Societies born here on Earth may simply be rehearsals for older civilizations that continue elsewhere, in realms untouched by time. Imagine for a moment that every great city, Thebes, Athens, Tenochtitlan, still exists, not in ruins but in another dimension, carried forward in the timeless fabric of the afterlife. When we die, perhaps we do not only meet ancestors, but also rejoin those civilizations, walking once more through streets that are alive, their decline reversed, their memory restored into permanence. It could be that what we call history is simply the visible trace of a deeper cycle. Civilizations here are temporary, fragile, bound by time. Civilizations there are eternal, persisting through every rise and fall, holding their place in a cosmic rhythm that never ends. And maybe, when we look at the ruins of our world, we are seeing not loss but transition, reminders that everything returns, that nothing truly vanishes, that beyond this plane civilizations continue on, waiting for us to join them once more. Across many traditions, death is not cast as chaos or collapse, but as the quiet work that keeps balance intact. The Egyptians spoke of Ma'at, the principle of truth, order, and harmony that held the universe together. Every soul that entered the afterlife was weighed against the feather of Ma'at. If the scales balanced, the soul could join the eternal community of the dead, adding its weight to the order of the cosmos. If not, it was cast aside, dissolved into nothingness. For the Egyptians, the participation of the dead was not passive. By entering the field of reeds in balance, they became part of the machinery that sustained the cosmos itself. The idea that the departed maintain balance is not unique to Egypt. In China, the veneration of ancestors was seen not only as honoring the past, but as ensuring harmony in the present. The dead were still active participants in society, invisible governors of fortune, rainfall, health, and justice. To neglect them was to risk imbalance. To honor them was to keep the world in rhythm. In West African traditions, too, the ancestors were not gone. They lived in another realm and continued to watch, advise, and intervene. Their presence kept the living aligned with the larger order of creation. Even in Greek myth, the order of the underworld reflected this principle. The souls of the dead were not scattered randomly. They were sorted, judged, and placed, some to Elysium, some to the asphodel meadows, some to darker realms. The placement of souls was part of keeping the moral balance of the cosmos. Justice, in this sense, did not end with life. It was maintained by the organization of the dead. Speculatively, this suggests that the civilization of the dead is not simply a reflection of ours, but its foundation. It is the hidden scaffolding that keeps our world from unraveling. Every death, then, is not only a departure but a contribution. Each soul joins the invisible order, becoming one more thread in the tapestry that holds reality together. Imagine the afterlife as a vast city, its walls not built of stone but of balance itself. Each new arrival is like a brick placed into its foundations. Without these bricks, the structure might weaken, the cosmos tilt toward disorder. In this view, the dead are not gone. They are workers in the architecture of balance, citizens of a society whose purpose is nothing less than the maintenance of the cosmic order. This reframes mortality in a profound way. To die is not to vanish, nor even simply to migrate. It is to take up a role in a greater system, to help maintain the equilibrium that allows the living to go on. Our world does not endure despite death, but because of it. The unseen civilization beyond the veil is not merely waiting, it is working, quietly, eternally, keeping the music of the cosmos in tune. And so, perhaps our fear of death blinds us to its deeper function. Each passing is not a subtraction but an addition. Each loss we mourn is, in the larger pattern, a renewal, one more soul woven into the society that keeps order from slipping into chaos. If every death is a renewal, then the question emerges with clarity. What if death is not an ending at all, but a return? Imagine that individual life, with all its joys and burdens, is not a complete story in itself, but a chapter temporarily cut from a larger book. Birth, in this vision, is a departure from the community of souls, a stepping out into separation for the sake of learning and experience. Death, then, is the homecoming, the act of returning the chapter to the book from which it was briefly removed. This changes everything about how we see mortality. Instead of vanishing, the self rejoins a larger community that has always been there, waiting patiently. The loneliness of death, so feared in human imagination, dissolves into reunion. The silence of the grave becomes the chorus of voices welcoming a traveler back, and life itself, fragile and fleeting, gains new weight. It is not meaningless brevity, but a pilgrimage whose value lies precisely in its return. Cultures across the world carry echoes of this idea. In the Tibetan Bardo teachings, the soul moves through luminous states after death before being drawn again into the cycle of existence. In Christian thought, death is described as returning to the Father's house, a dwelling prepared long before we arrived. Among many indigenous peoples, death is not an exile but a circling back into the community of ancestors who never left but simply shifted into another form of presence. Speculatively, this continuity suggests that what we call individuality may be a temporary illusion. Here on Earth, we live as single persons, with names, faces, and stories that feel utterly our own. But perhaps individuality is like a costume necessary for the play of earthly existence, but removed when we step backstage. When the curtain falls, we set aside the name, the face, the costume, and rejoin the cast from which we came. Imagine it. You take your last breath, and instead of falling into darkness, you awaken into a hall filled with familiar presences. They greet you not with surprise, but with recognition. To them, you were never truly gone, only on a long journey. You realize, with a shock that turns instantly into comfort, that you are home. The struggles of your brief earthly sojourn were not meaningless, but threads woven into the vast communal fabric that stretches beyond time. If this is true, then life itself is not separation unto despair, but separation unto purpose. We leave the eternal city of souls not because we are cast out, but because there is something to learn in being alone, in being small, in being mortal. We go out to experience, and we return to contribute. Each life enriches the community it rejoins, each fragment adding depth to the whole. Thus, death is not the collapse of self, but its restoration, not a subtraction, but a completion, not exile, but return. And if this is so, then we do not die at all, we only go back to where we have always belonged, to the society beyond the veil, to the civilization that holds us, remembers us, and welcomes us back into eternity. And yet, for all the comfort offered by visions of return, there is another possibility we cannot set aside. What if death is not a rejoining, but a cessation? What if the breath ends, the neurons fade, and the self that once held memories and dreams simply dissolves? To imagine this is to imagine finality, not a door opening into another hall, but the extinguishing of the lamp itself. In this view, the great myths of the afterlife may not be roadmaps to other civilizations, but metaphors. They could be humanity's way of holding grief, of shaping the unbearable truth of loss into stories that soften it. The Egyptian field of reeds, the Norse halls of Valhalla, the Buddhist Pure Lands, perhaps all of them are symbolic mirrors of our longing, not descriptions of places beyond. Even if this is so, there is still meaning, for myths, whether factual or not, give structure to mourning. They allow the living to imagine their loved ones not as vanished, but as continuing in some form, even if only in memory. A child, crying at the loss of a parent, finds comfort in the image of that parent walking fields of light. A widow, lighting incense, imagines her partner joining the ancestors. In this sense, the civilizations of the dead may be no less real for being imagined. They exist in the collective mind, shaping the way we endure sorrow. Speculatively, if death is final, then these myths are not windows but bridges, ways for the living to cross the chasm of grief. They hold us together in the face of loss. They teach us that love extends beyond the boundaries of life, even if the person we love does not. The stories remain, and in them, so do we. Imagine a city not built beyond the veil, but constructed here, in memory. Its streets are our stories, its halls are our rituals, its fields are our songs and prayers. Every time we remember the dead, we rebuild that city, stone by stone, word by word. It may not exist in some eternal plane, but it exists in us, and that may be enough. Even if death is final, the civilizations we envision after it still shape the civilizations we build in life. They remind us of order, justice, compassion, and continuity. They whisper that we belong to something greater, even if that greatness is only the shared imagination of humanity. In this way, myths are not false. They are necessary. They give weight to mourning, direction to memory, and dignity to the fragile span of human life. And so, whether death is return or finality, whether the civilization of the dead is real or only dreamed, it still gives us meaning. Even imagined, it offers us a way to carry love beyond loss, to hold the dead close, and to remember that we are always part of something larger than ourselves. Across every culture, death has never been treated as an event to be endured silently. It is met with structure, with ceremony, with ritual. These practices, sometimes elaborate, sometimes simple, have always served as bridges between the living and the dead. If there is another civilization awaiting the soul, rituals are its passports. If there is not, they are the language by which the living honor memory. Either way, they are indispensable. Consider the ancient Egyptians, who built entire industries around preparation for the afterlife. Mummification was not simply preservation of flesh, it was transformation. Priests whispered incantations over organs, amulets were tucked into wrappings, and sacred texts were painted on tomb walls to guide the soul through the perils of the duat. The pyramid itself was not merely a monument but a vessel, angled toward the heavens, pointing the departed toward eternity. In Tibet, sky burials lift the body into the open air, where birds carry it away. To Western eyes, this may look unsettling, but to Tibetan Buddhists it is an act of generosity, returning flesh to the cycle of life, while the consciousness moves on. The ritual acknowledges that the body was always a temporary vessel. The offering becomes both release and preparation, ensuring that the soul is not bound by the remnants of the flesh it once inhabited. In ancient Greece, coins were placed in the mouths of the dead payment for Charon, ferryman of the Styx. The rite was small but essential. Without it, the soul could not cross the river, condemned to linger on its banks. In China, paper offerings are still burned replicas of houses, clothes, even money gifts for ancestors to use in the other realm. In indigenous traditions across the Americas, songs are sung at funerals, songs that map the geography of the spirit world, ensuring that the departed will not lose their way. Each of these rites carries the same logic. The dead are travelers, and travelers need preparation. A journey cannot be undertaken empty-handed. Ritual becomes the luggage, the currency, the guidebook. Speculatively, we might imagine that these practices do more than honor belief. Perhaps they truly act as signals to the other side. A pyramid gleaming in the desert sun might be a beacon not only for the living but for souls returning to the eternal city. A song sung over a body might open a gate or remind the traveler of the path. The burning of offerings might echo across dimensions, ensuring that the dead arrive with the tools they need. Even if there is no other civilization beyond death, rituals still perform profound work. They transform grief into action. They give the living something to do in the face of loss, allowing them to shape chaos into order. A body buried with care tells the community, this life mattered, this departure has weight. The ritual, then, is as much for those who remain as for those who go. Imagine standing at the edge of a burial ground, watching smoke rise into the sky, or hearing drums echo across the night as a body is laid to rest. What you are witnessing is not only mourning, but preparation. The dead are being equipped as travelers. The community is sending them forward, ensuring they will not be lost, ensuring they will arrive whether in memory or in a civilization beyond the veil. If rituals are the passports of the dead, then monuments are their dwellings, structures built not for the living alone, but as reflections of the societies the departed were believed to join. Across the world, the architecture of death is among humanity's most enduring art. From the pyramids that rise above the sands to the humble cairns scattered on lonely hillsides, what we build for the dead is often more permanent than what we build for ourselves. Consider the great tombs of Egypt, massive stone pyramids aligned with the stars. These were not just graves. They were cosmic diagrams, models of the eternal realm, constructed so that the pharaoh might ascend into the company of gods. Every wall was inscribed with spells, every chamber filled with goods, food, furniture, ornaments, as though the other world required the same infrastructure as this one. In China, the mausoleum of Emperor Qin Shi Huang stretches across vast underground halls guarded by the terracotta army. Thousands of clay soldiers, chariots, and horses were crafted to serve him beyond death. Here, death is imagined not as dissolution, but as continuation of empire. The architecture declares that the emperor will rule on in another world, his court and his armies intact. Among the Mycenaeans, shaft graves were filled with masks of beaten gold, as though the dead would need new faces in the afterlife. In the tombs of the Vikings, ships were buried with their owners, sails furled for a voyage across unseen seas. And in indigenous cultures worldwide, from the mound builders of North America to the megaliths of Europe, Earth itself was shaped into monuments, hills and stones arranged to echo celestial alignments, ensuring the dead were tied to cosmic order. These structures are not simply for memory, they are attempts to echo the architecture of the other side. The field of reeds, Valhalla, Elysium, Mictlan, these are not shapeless voids, but places with halls, bridges, rivers, and gates. In building tombs, temples, and shrines, humans may be imitating what they sense awaits them. The city of the dead is mirrored in stone, wood, and earth, so that when the soul crosses over, it does not enter strangeness, but familiarity. Speculatively, this imitation might be more than symbolic. Perhaps the act of building for the dead a pyramid, a cairn, a temple actually forges a resonance with the true civilization beyond. The monument becomes a doorway, a reflection that allows the two realms to touch. To walk among ancient tombs may be to stand at the threshold of that other city, the living unknowingly treading in the footprints of the eternal. And even if the afterlife is nothing more than memory, these structures still serve as cities of remembrance. They preserve the dead within the architecture of culture itself. A grave is not just a resting place, it is a story carved in earth and stone. A temple is not only a site of worship, but a gathering hall where the living commune with their ancestors. Through these constructions, the dead remain citizens of the living world. Look around at the ruins scattered across the earth: pyramids, dolmens, barrows, temples crumbling into dust. They may seem silent, but in truth they are echoes. Each one is an imitation of the civilization of the dead, a shadow of halls and cities that exist beyond sight. What we have built in memory may be, at heart, humanity's way of rehearsing the architecture of eternity. When we step back from stone and ritual, we arrive again at the central riddle: consciousness itself. What is it that leaves the body at death, if anything? Is awareness a product of neurons and chemistry alone, extinguished when the brain falls silent? Or is it something deeper, something woven into the fabric of the universe? Modern neuroscience often frames the mind as an emergent property, the coordinated firing of billions of neurons producing the sense of self. In this model, consciousness is fragile, dependent on blood flow and oxygen, dissolving as easily as a candle flame in the wind. And yet, certain theories suggest something more. Physicists like Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff have speculated that consciousness may have quantum roots, microtubules within neurons, acting not merely as scaffolding, but as quantum processors. If that is true, then the mind may not be wholly local to the brain. It may be entangled with the deeper structure of reality itself. Others propose models of the non-local mind, the idea that consciousness is not generated by the brain, but accessed through it, as radio waves are accessed through a receiver. In this view, the brain is a filter, narrowing a vast field of awareness into the manageable stream we call daily thought. Death, then, would not destroy consciousness but release it, like lifting a dam from a river. The stream does not vanish, it rejoins the ocean. Speculatively, this suggests that awareness is a form of information that persists, regardless of biology. Physics tells us that information cannot be destroyed, even when matter changes form. A star collapses, a forest burns, but the information encoded in those events is preserved in the universe's fabric. Could consciousness be the same? Not an illusion, not a trick of matter, but a fundamental property of reality, like space, time, and energy. If so, then death is not the end of the self, but its reconnection with the source. Imagine your awareness not as a flame snuffed out, but as a spark returning to the great fire from which it came. Individuality dissolves, yes, but not into nothingness. It dissolves into everything. You become part of the luminous field that underlies the cosmos, the same field that ancient traditions called the soul, the divine, the eternal. Picture it. In the moment of death, as neurons flicker and fail, the filter falls away. Suddenly you are not confined to a body, not bound by seconds or minutes. You expand into the ocean of consciousness itself. Around you is not silence but a chorus, not emptiness but fullness, the voices of all who have returned, all who have always been. This could be the foundation of the civilization of the dead, not streets and towers of matter, but a community of awareness, woven together into a vast field of memory and presence, a city made not of stone, but of mind. A society beyond biology, eternal because it is rooted not in flesh but in the very structure of reality. Physics offers us a strange consolation. Nothing, in the deepest sense, is ever truly lost. Matter transforms, energy changes form, stars collapse and scatter into dust, yet the information encoded in these transformations is never erased. The laws of thermodynamics and the insights of quantum theory insist upon this. Information is preserved, though it may be hidden, rearranged, or beyond our current power to retrieve. If that is true for the fall of stars, might it also be true for the fall of consciousness? Every thought, every memory, every flicker of awareness, could these be recorded in the fabric of the universe itself? Some physicists suggest that black holes, once thought to erase information, may in fact preserve it on their horizons, etched into the very geometry of space-time. If the cosmos itself functions as an archive, then perhaps the death of a human being is not annihilation, but inscription. Each life becomes a record, stored in the eternal library of reality. Speculatively, this universal archive may be what ancient traditions have always intuited. The Akashic records of Hindu and theosophical thought describe a subtle plane where every deed, word, and thought is preserved. The Egyptian Book of the Dead imagines judgment halls where the truth of a person's life is weighed. In Christian eschatology, there is the Book of Life, in which all names are written. Different symbols, different cultures, but the same intuition. Nothing is forgotten. If so, then the civilization of the dead may rest upon this cosmic database. Imagine a society not built of stone or even light, but of memory itself. Every consciousness that has ever lived is not gone but preserved, woven into the archive. The afterlife could then be less a separate realm and more a re-entry into the great record, becoming part of the eternal library that holds all lives together. Picture walking through such a place. The walls are not walls at all, but memories, shimmering like tapestries. In one corridor, the laughter of a child from centuries past. In another, the voice of a poet reciting words never written down, yet somehow preserved. The air itself hums with the stories of countless beings, each one alive in memory, each one accessible in the great architecture of the archive. To enter it is to realize that nothing was ever wasted, nothing was ever erased. Every kindness, every cruelty, every dream, and every silence lives on. And what if our own consciousness, at death, does not dissolve but integrates into this archive? Then the self is not lost but expanded. You become not only yourself, but the sum of all selves, part of the endless collection that makes up the civilization of the dead. Each death strengthens it, enlarges it, adds another volume to its infinite shelves. In this way, physics and myth converge. The scientist says, information cannot be destroyed. The mystic says, every soul is preserved. Together they whisper the same truth that death is not erasure, but storage, not oblivion, but continuation in another form. And perhaps, when we speak of joining the ancestors, of entering the city of souls, we are describing this very process. The return of consciousness to the universal archive, where all lives are remembered and nothing is ever lost. And yet, even with myths to comfort us, even with philosophies and sciences suggesting continuity, the fear of death persists. It lingers in the quiet hours, in the pauses between thoughts, in the hush of hospital corridors. No civilization, however rich in stories of return or eternity, has ever fully banished the dread of the end. Why does this fear endure? Partly because death represents the unknown. For all the tales of tunnels and light, for all the visions of cities beyond, we cannot verify them with certainty. What waits beyond the final breath remains hidden. Human beings are creatures of pattern, comforted by predictability, and nothing is less predictable than the moment of departure. There is also the fear of separation. Myths promise reunion with ancestors, but the immediacy of loss is felt here, in the world of the living. To lose a parent, a friend, a child, no vision of eternity can erase the ache of their absence at the dinner table, their silence in the room. Fear persists not only of what happens to us, but of what happens to those we love. Civilizations have built their laws, their ethics, their structures around this persistent fear. Burial practices are codified, funerals ritualized, mourning periods prescribed. Entire systems of justice hinge on the weight of death executions, inheritances, memorials. Kings and emperors commissioned monuments not only to demonstrate power, but to wrestle with mortality, to inscribe their names against the silence. The laws of succession, the structures of dynasties, even the rhythms of calendars, all are influenced by the inevitability of death. In this way, death is not merely a private mystery but a public architect. It shapes the way societies organize themselves. Without the awareness of mortality, would we treasure legacy? Would we build monuments, write books, preserve traditions? Would we pass down laws and customs if not for the quiet knowledge that one day we will not be here to explain them? Speculatively, the fear of death may be less an enemy than a force of creation. Without it, perhaps there would be no civilization at all. The awareness of our finitude drives us to create, to preserve, to pass on. Fear births culture, anxiety about endings births continuity. The civilization of the living may itself exist because of the fear of joining or failing to join the civilization of the dead. And so, even as myths promise peace, the fear endures, shaping us, guiding us, and ensuring that what we leave behind will outlast the brief flicker of our individual lives. If fear has been one of death's great teachers, then liberation has always been its hidden promise. While countless traditions across the world have wrestled with mortality as a burden and a boundary, just as many have also celebrated it as release, a doorway not into despair, but into freedom. To approach death not as an enemy, but as a liberator is to shift one's vision of existence itself. In the philosophy of the Stoics, this perspective is especially clear. They counseled that to fear death was to misunderstand nature. Epictetus wrote that we should not lament what is outside our control, for such lament only binds us more tightly to suffering. Marcus Aurelius, emperor and philosopher, reflected that death is not annihilation but dissolution, the returning of body to earth and breath to air, spirit to cosmos. In this view, death is the moment when the illusion of separation is finally lifted. Just as leaves fall in autumn, not to be mourned but to nourish the soil for spring, so too human lives end in order to rejoin the greater flow of nature. Liberation is not merely personal but cosmic, the end of confinement in a single body, the restoration of one's being to the vast whole. Eastern traditions go even further. In Buddhism, liberation from the cycle of samsara, birth, death, and rebirth is the highest goal. To reach nirvana is to extinguish craving, and with it, the endless return to suffering. Death, when paired with awakening, is not feared but embraced, the passage into timeless peace. Here, liberation is radical. It is freedom not only from the body, but from the restless wheel of becoming. Death is not a tragic interruption of life, but the final dissolving of illusions. Sufi mystics, too, spoke of death not with dread but with longing. To them, it was the wedding night, the long-awaited union of the soul with the beloved, a joyous homecoming into divine presence. Jalal al-Din Rumi, one of the most luminous of their poets, urged his followers not to mourn him when he died, but to celebrate, for death would be the moment of his true birth into eternity. In this vision, liberation is not abstract philosophy but passionate reunion, the dissolving of all distance between the lover and the loved. Even in modern near-death accounts, this theme emerges. Those who have hovered on the threshold often describe not terror, but relief. The weight of anxiety, the constant hum of earthly concern seem to fall away in those moments. Many speak of a profound lightness, as though gravity itself had loosened its grip. Pain faded, worry dissolved, and in its place arose a peace so total that returning to the body was experienced not as a gift, but as a burden. For them, liberation was not a distant doctrine but an immediate sensation, remembered even after waking. Speculatively, if such accounts carry even a glimmer of truth, then the civilization of the dead may not merely be free of mortality, but free of fear itself. Imagine a society where no one counts down the hours, where no one fears decay, where the shadows of dread have no soil in which to grow. Human civilizations have always been built around the management of fear, fear of scarcity, fear of invasion, fear of death. Remove fear, and the entire structure of society shifts. What remains is not governance by control, but community rooted in openness. Not struggle for survival, but serenity in belonging. Picture yourself entering such a civilization. Streets do not pulse with anxiety, but with ease. Voices do not carry undertones of worry, but notes of calm recognition. Every encounter is infused with the certainty that nothing essential can ever be lost. To walk there is to breathe without burden. To speak there is to remember without regret. Death, in this light, is not exile but release into a realm where fear has no dominion. And there is something more. Liberation is not only from suffering, but from the narrowness of individuality itself. On earth, we are defined by boundaries, names, bodies, stories. But in a society free of fear, those boundaries soften. The self, once hemmed in by dread of loss, expands into a wider community where belonging is complete and unquestioned. You are still yourself, but more. You are also part of the whole, a citizen of a civilization where no shadow can fall. Thus, death becomes not the end of freedom, but its beginning. It is the return to a society unburdened by dread, where fear, humanity's oldest teacher and most persistent enemy, has already been dissolved into nothing. What remains is only freedom, as natural and enduring as breath, carrying the soul back into a civilization where peace is not the exception, but the law of existence itself. If the civilization of the dead is real, then humanity is not, and has never been, alone. Every person who has drawn breath belongs not to a single world but to two, the fragile realm of flesh and time, and the enduring society hidden just beyond the veil. In this vision, we are dual citizens, holders of two passports, one stamped with the struggles of earth and the other sealed with the memory of eternity. We move between these states of belonging, apprentices in one and full participants in the other, carrying experiences across the threshold like travelers bringing gifts from one land to another. Seen this way, life itself becomes a preparation ground. Our days are not isolated fragments destined to dissolve, but lessons, rehearsals, chapters in an immense book whose pages extend beyond mortality. Each act of kindness strengthens our role in the greater community. Each cruelty, though painful, becomes a necessary lesson written into our record. In this sense, the civilization of the dead is not foreign. It is the elder society, the original homeland, the place from which all journeys begin and to which all journeys return. Earthly life is not exile but apprenticeship, a school of impermanence in which we are taught what eternity cannot teach: the urgency of compassion, the discipline of patience, the weight of choices when time is scarce. Across cultures, this apprenticeship has been expressed in vivid symbolic forms. In Egypt, the weighing of the heart was not a test of might but of harmony. Did the soul live in balance with Ma'at, the principle of truth and order? A light heart passed easily into the eternal fields. A heavy heart, burdened with imbalance, could not. In Christian thought, earthly life is imagined as pilgrimage, each deed preparing the traveler for the Father's house, where a dwelling has been made ready since the dawn of time. Among indigenous traditions, life is not linear but circular. Each generation lives not only for itself, but as practice for joining the council of ancestors. Here, honor is not about conquest but about harmony with land, kin, and spirit. Despite their differences, each of these perspectives suggests the same truth. Life here is provisional, and what matters most is how it prepares the soul for its place in the greater society. Speculatively, if the civilization of the dead exists, then its influence may already reach us in ways we scarcely recognize. Perhaps the laws we write, the myths we tell, the rituals we keep are not inventions of human ingenuity alone, but echoes from that older order. When we imagine justice, perhaps we are recalling the cosmic balance of the other realm. When we speak of community beyond self, perhaps we are remembering the deeper belonging we once knew. Even the very shape of our cities, with their walls, avenues, and gathering halls, may be imitations of a pattern etched into our collective memory. In this sense, we are not inventors but apprentices, practicing here the structures of a greater society. Imagine, then, that every action in life is not observed as a ledger of judgment but as a rehearsal. When you forgive someone who wronged you, you are practicing the generosity that shapes your role in the eternal city. When you create a story, a song, a shelter, you are building in miniature what will one day stand in permanence. When you fail, when you harm, when you forget, you are not condemned but reminded. You are still in apprenticeship. The lessons continue until you return, carrying your experiences as tools, as stories, as bricks for the civilization beyond death. And in this vision, humanity is not drifting in an indifferent cosmos. We are participants in a larger order, citizens of a society that waits patiently beyond perception. Life, with all its struggles and wonders, is not meaningless suffering but necessary practice, the training ground for eternity. The civilization of the dead does not erase our earthly lives. It gathers them, remembers them, and weaves them into its timeless fabric. Every laugh, every tear, every act of courage or despair is taken up into its walls, strengthening the city with the substance of our experience. Thus, if the civilization of the dead exists, then we are not merely mortal beings bound for dissolution. We are apprentices of eternity, shaping ourselves through the trials of life in preparation for the oldest citizenship of all, one where love, balance, and memory are not fleeting virtues but eternal laws written into the very architecture of existence. But what if the civilization of the dead does not exist? What if, beyond the veil, there are no radiant cities, no ancestral councils, no timeless archives of memory, only silence? This possibility, stark as it seems, does not render our myths meaningless. On the contrary, it may be that the very absence of proof is what makes the myth so powerful, so enduring, and so necessary for the survival of human civilization. Across millennia, cultures have clothed mortality in stories, not because they could prove them, but because they could not endure without them. The pyramids of Egypt, the terraced tombs of China, the sacred burial mounds of indigenous peoples, the cathedrals and cemeteries of Europe, each is an architectural answer to an existential question. If there is no other world beyond, then these myths and monuments are not maps of eternity but mirrors of humanity. They reflect back to us our longing, our grief, and our determination to keep meaning alive even in the face of death. The myth of the afterlife, in this view, is civilization's greatest act of generosity to itself. It does not banish death, but it softens its edge, shaping it into a story that can be told, sung, and shared. It transforms despair into ritual, absence into memory, and endings into symbols of continuity. Even if there is no eternal city awaiting us, the very idea of such a city has inspired us to build our own, to raise temples, to write scriptures, to create laws that honor the dead and preserve their place among the living. Speculatively, the civilization of the dead may not exist beyond space and time, but it exists within us as the architecture of imagination. Each story of reunion, each vision of ancestral halls, is a structure built in the mind and heart, binding communities together. When we tell children that their grandparents watch over them, we are not describing an external reality, but creating an internal one, ensuring that love extends beyond the grave. When we gather to mourn and speak of the dead as gone home, we are not reporting fact, but shaping meaning. And in this way, the myth functions no less powerfully than truth. The idea of a society beyond death is itself one of the foundations of society among the living. It has given humanity a reason to honor life, to preserve memory, to temper cruelty with compassion. Even if the dead do not dwell in another realm, the belief that they do has kept countless generations tethered to hope. It has comforted the grieving, restrained the violent, inspired the artist, and sustained the philosopher. Imagine, then, a city that does not stand in eternity but in imagination. Its streets are paved with stories, its walls built of rituals, its towers formed by memory. It is no less real for being unseen. Each time we remember our dead, each time we speak their names, we lay another stone in its foundation. This city is not waiting on the far side of death, it is already here, woven into the fabric of culture, carried in the breath of every myth. Thus, even if the civilization of the dead does not exist, the myth of its existence has given us one of the greatest gifts of all, a way to endure mortality without despair. It is the unseen thread that has kept human societies together, reminding us that though we may be fragile, we are never without meaning. The myth does not need to be real in order to be true. It is true because it has shaped us, bound us, and carried us across the ages. If myths are the thread binding us together, then our role within this great weave is not passive but participatory. Whether the civilization of the dead exists as a literal realm beyond perception or as an imagined architecture of hope, humanity's actions here shape its outline. We are, in a sense, always preparing ourselves, preparing our communities, preparing the very fabric of existence for continuity beyond the individual span of years. Each life, no matter how brief, adds to this preparation. Our kindnesses ripple outward, leaving traces in memory and ritual. Our mistakes, too, are not wasted. They are transformed into lessons carried forward by those who remember. In this way, nothing vanishes. Even the smallest gesture, a word spoken in comfort, a seed planted in soil, a song shared in darkness becomes part of a larger legacy that may travel with us into that older civilization, or remain here as the groundwork for generations yet to come. Across cultures, this continuity has been acknowledged in symbolic and practical ways. The Egyptians believed that deeds shaped one's fate in the field of reeds, and that the living had a duty to honor and sustain the departed through offerings and prayers. In Hindu thought, karma is both burden and blessing, the chain of cause and effect that shapes rebirth, binding actions across lifetimes. Among indigenous peoples, ancestors are never absent. They walk with the living, receiving the offerings of food, song, and story, and guiding communities through memory and dream. Each of these traditions suggests that what we do here matters not only for ourselves, but for the balance of the greater cycle. Speculatively, this means that our lives may be seen as rehearsals for participation in that elder society. The civilizations we build on Earth could be echoes of the eternal one. We will rejoin rough sketches of the original design. When we build cities, perhaps we are imitating the city of souls. When we draft laws, perhaps we are echoing the cosmic balance. When we remember the dead, perhaps we are renewing the bridge between this world and the next. Humanity's creativity, its rituals, and its capacity for remembrance may all be evidence that we are apprentices of a deeper order, practicing here what we will one day take up in fullness. Imagine the moment of death, then, not as vanishing but as integration. You walk into halls that feel strangely familiar, not because you've seen them before, but because your actions helped build them. Every kindness you gave is a stone in their foundation. Every story you told is an inscription on their walls. Every memory you carried is a window through which light now shines. The civilization of the dead is not distant and separate, but partially composed of the lives we live here, each generation adding to its structure, each soul strengthening its form. Thus, humanity's role in the cycle is both humble and exalted. Humble, because we are fleeting, fragile, fallible. Exalted, because through our very fragility, we contribute to something vast and enduring. We are not exiles trapped in a temporary world, but apprentices gathering wisdom, memory, and meaning to carry with us. Our actions are not lost to time, they are carried into eternity, woven into the oldest civilization of all. In this sense, death is not a rupture but a return, and life is not a trial but a preparation. Humanity's role in the cycle is to live fully, to remember deeply, and to contribute meaningfully so that when we step across the threshold, we do not enter as strangers, but as builders returning to the city they helped create. There is a deep and haunting beauty in the idea that death is not obliteration, but return. To see it this way is to transform the most feared of human experiences into the most intimate of homecomings. The poetry of return does not deny the grief of parting or the pain of loss, but it reframes them within a larger arc, one where every ending is also a beginning, and every departure is a step toward reunion. Cultures have long expressed this in language closer to poetry than to doctrine. The Greeks spoke of the Isles of the Blessed, a realm of perpetual spring where heroes walked in harmony, not as strangers, but as those who had found their way back. The Norse envisioned Valhalla, a hall not of exile but of fellowship, where feasts never ended and bonds were eternal. Among the Maori of Aotearoa, the spirit journeys north to Cape Reinga, leaping into the sea to rejoin the homeland of Hawaii. In West African traditions, death is described as crossing into the village of the ancestors, where the departed gather in community, not vanishing but continuing in a form more enduring than flesh. These images, though diverse, share a unifying thread: death as homecoming. It is not the cold silence of exile but the warmth of return, the rediscovery of a place already written into the soul. Speculatively, this could mean that what we fear as the unknown is in fact the most familiar of all landscapes. Death may strip away not our identity, but our forgetfulness, allowing us to remember what we have always known, that we belong to a greater city, a timeless society of souls. To die, then, is not to disappear but to awaken. Picture it. You step beyond your final breath and find yourself in a city not made of stone, but of memory and light. Its streets curve in ways that feel like old songs, rhythms you once knew. Its towers shimmer like crystal, yet there is nothing alien about them. You recognize their shapes as though they were drawn long ago in the corners of your dreams. Around you gather figures not strangers, but kin. Some bear the faces of parents, grandparents, and friends long gone. Others are more distant, yet their presence stirs in you a recognition deeper than names. They do not ask who you are, for they already know. They embrace you not with curiosity, but with welcome. In this dreamlike city, time has no dominion. The ancestors walk alongside those yet unborn. Stories mingle and intertwine, forming an endless chorus. The air is alive with belonging. Here, nothing is lost. Every memory becomes a stone in its walls. Every act of love becomes a song in its avenues. Every life enriches the fabric of its eternal community. The poetry of return lies not only in this vision of reunion, but in what it offers the living, the courage to face mortality with tenderness rather than terror. It whispers that death is not the end of the story, but the rediscovery of its beginning. That the silence we dread is in truth the pause before recognition, the moment before we remember that we are going home. And so, when we imagine death as return, we find ourselves less afraid. We see not the abyss, but the threshold. Not the collapse, but the homecoming. It is a dream, yes, but one so deeply woven into the human heart that it feels like memory. And in that dream, we see ourselves stepping into a city beyond time, where ancestors wait with open arms, and where, at last, we are known. Across centuries and continents, humanity has spoken of death not as disappearance, but as passage, a crossing of rivers, a return to fields of light, an entry into halls where ancestors gather. Myths, rituals, and modern testimonies all echo the same refrain, that death is less an end than a return, less a vanishing than a rejoining of something older, larger, and eternal. And yet, the question remains, when we die, do we vanish into silence, or do we step back into the oldest civilization of all, a realm that has watched over us since the first breath was drawn, waiting patiently for our return? Picture it, the moment after the final heartbeat, when darkness closes in. Then slowly, gates open in that darkness vast and luminous. Beyond them lies not emptiness, but a gathering. Voices rise to greet you, familiar yet timeless, carrying the cadence of belonging. They do not call you as a stranger, but as one of their own. And in that instant, you understand. You have come home.